is Corey Lewandowski. He, of course, was the president's campaign manager during the primary, remains a close ally to the president, and currently serves as a senior advisor to the vice president's super PAC. Mr. Lewandowski, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Chuck.
All right. So I feel like we've been down this road before. Oh, the president's furious at John Kelly. His days are numbered. You'll come on the show and say, I think John Kelly should be replaced. You've said that 6 months ago. You said that, I believe, 12 months ago. Are things different this time or not? What's your sense?
Look, I think what this president is now seeing a week after the election results were on election night, as the numbers started to roll in, it looked, by and large, at first, it was going to be a very good night for Republicans. Mike Braun's race was called very early in Indiana. Andy Barr's seat in Kentucky, with the polls closed early, he held on. So there was a bit of maybe overjoy that things were going to go better than they were. Now, we're still in this process of determining who has won some of these races. We've still got 8 or 9 congressional seats that haven't been decided. And what we're seeing is most of those are breaking against the Republicans. And so the president went, I think, from a victory that night to now coming to the realization that the House is not where it wanted to be.
Did he really believe Republicans were going to hold the House?
Well, I think it was going to be closer.
Did he believe it?
I think he believed it was going to be closer than it was. And we see a number of these close races that are within 1,000 votes that the Republicans are losing. And we didn't see as many gains in the Senate. So what has he done? He's looked internally at his staff and said, going into his first and only re-election campaign, do I have the right team? And that's where the rumors are coming from. The person who's rumored to replace John Kelly,
Nick Ayers.
Nick Ayers is the vice president's chief of staff.
Ran the RGA, sort of somebody with a lot more campaign chops
That's right.
than John Kelly does.
It's a very different mold than what John Kelly has. John Kelly's a process guy. He's a policy person who wants to make sure that's done properly. Nick Ayers is a political animal, and I mean that in a positive sense. He's a man who knows the congressional districts, and if the president wants to make a change so that what happened to some of the congressional Republicans doesn't happen to him in 2 years.
Does he accept any of the blame? The president on what happened in the suburbs? I mean, the suburbs, it's a rebuke in the suburbs.
Well,
we can have a conversation about what happened in different states, totality, but you look in these suburbs, you guys got clobbered.
Well, and if you look, I believe, by and large, at the candidates who ran with the president in a number of races, they did better. If you look in Missouri, you look in North Dakota, you look in some of these places.
They didn't have a lot of suburbs to win.
No, that's right.
I mean, in fairness.
That's right. But, historically speaking, the Republicans were supposed to lose the House in a historical precedence. That's what normally happens. Now, they lost about 34 seats, 35 seats right now. Maybe it goes to 40. Yep. We don't know. But if you look back at where Barack Obama was, where Bill Clinton was, I believe that the margin was as small as it was because the president went on the campaign. And guys like Andy Barr, in a competitive congressional district in Kentucky, embraced the president, and he won a tough race because of it.
Non-suburban seat, though.
True.
Okay, in fairness, on that front. I am curious, a lot of these midterm rebukes, the president, you had President Bush in 06, I think, call it a shellacking. I think President Obama said, we got whooped or something. I may be conflating the two comments. This president doesn't seem to want to accept that the voters want him to change. Does he accept the idea that some of this was about voters saying, hey, look, can you tone it down? Can you do less of the tweets or less of this? Does he at all see any of that?
Look, I think what the president sees is the effort that he put in the last 6 or 8 weeks of the campaign.
He only sees the positive side of things.
Look, he did more campaign stops than either of his 2 predecessors, if not combined. So he was on the road. He was very active. And
a lot of candidates didn't want him around, though.
Well, look, and the vice president did a lot of stops as well. And the president said, I'm not on the ballot, but my policies are. So he's very aware that some of those members that lost in places where it was a rebuke of some of the policies. But if you care about the economy, you care about homeland security, you care about national security, everything is better today than it was 2 years ago. Now, if you care about the style and you don't like the president's style, that's not going to change. He's not going to drop the Twitter account tomorrow and stop tweeting. And I think his base is more emboldened than ever. He's stronger with the Republicans than he's ever been when you poll them. And when it comes to the left, he's more vilified than ever there. So it's really about the middle. And the American people, those independents, those moderates, have to decide what issue is most important to them. If it's homeland security, economic security, or national security, they have to decide if they want to support this president moving forward.
Does he believe somehow these elections were taken from him, though? Like, he's talking about election fraud as if it's something that's very common.
No, look, I don't think so.
Or is that just chum for the base?
Look, I think where it is when you look at now 2 counties in Florida, the same 2 counties that always seem to have problems. The question is, why haven't we done better? 2 years ago, after Donald Trump won the election, the question was there an outside influence? Did we have integrity in the balloting process? Were the results appropriate? Was there an outside force from Russia or China or somewhere else? What we're seeing now is that we can't count our own ballots. We're the most, we're the greatest country in the world, and we're having a hard time counting how many ballots are available on election night. They're not reporting properly. We need to do a better job.
But isn't there is there to go immediately to fraud? You spin the, you spin your folks, and then people assume the worst. When, look, there might be some incompetency. There might be just overwhelm. And by the way, it is certainly he's within his legal right to get a machine recount. It fell within the law.
Absolutely. And what's going on in Florida, I don't think either Senator-elect Scott or Ron DeSantis has said that there has been any voting improprieties. No one's made a claim that there has been something illegal taking place.
They're alluding that it could happen, which is in and of itself is a way of, well, I'm not saying, but I'm saying it could be. Well, and come on, when you do that, that conditions people to think the worst.
The reason they're doing that is because an attorney for Bill Nelson went into court and said there are individuals who are not U.S. citizens and we want to have those votes counted. Now, Mark Elias came out and said that was a mistake. We don't want to have that. We will only have U.S. citizens counted. But you can look at that and say, why would an attorney for an incumbent U.S. senator who's here for the ballot integrity say we want to have non-citizen ballots counted?
Do you really think that's what you really think he meant for non-citizens?
I don't. Look, maybe he made a mistake and they clarified it. Mark Elias clarified it. But what we've also heard is, there are a number of ballots that were put back in that maybe should or maybe shouldn't have been counted. The most important thing, Chuck, is that there's integrity in the process, and every vote gets counted, but it gets counted properly.
Let's look at the larger battleground map. Because on one hand, I could look at some of your path and say, okay, things got better. A place like Ohio looks more locked down today. Iowa, you guys held there with the governorship. I think a lot of us assumed that if this was a good Democratic night, that would fall. Is your path still the Midwest? Or do you look at what happened in Arizona, Georgia, and Florida and think, boy, we got to play a lot more expensive, and even Texas, expensive defense than we expected?
Look, I think the path is always going to go through Florida, number one. It's going to go through North Carolina. We've got Senator Tom Tillis, who's up for re-election in 2 years in what is going to be a very competitive state. Mm-hmm. That's going to go through there. We know Georgia has become much more competitive. I think Kemp is going to have been the governor there for 2 years, and that's going to be important. But the Republicans lost 7 governorships, important ones by and large.
Why do you think that happened?
Wisconsin. Look, I think there's some voter fatigue in some places. I think the message that Donald Trump has that does not necessarily translate to individual other candidates. We saw it's very true with Barack Obama. People voted for him, but when he campaigned for others, it didn't correlate the same way. So losing 7 governor's races and having to be out in South Dakota campaigning for the Republican governor the day before should be a wake-up call to the Republican Party. And I also look at the states like New Mexico and Arizona and Nevada, places where the state party needs to do a better job of recruiting good candidates, making sure there is not a competitive primary process for those candidates, and having the resources necessary in states where the demographics are changing considerably to make sure they're reaching out for those new demographics.
And my guess is those same folks are saying, hey, the president's message is making it harder to recruit those new demographics. Yeah, but making it harder to find a Latino candidate that feels comfortable.
Even in Arizona,
in the president's party.
The senator-elect came out the day before the election and said, I support putting military troops on the border, right? That's the state of Arizona is the front line of the issue of immigration. There is a reason where she said that. There's and look, Doug Ducey, the governor of Arizona, won by a wide margin. There was a lot of crossover. The Republicans have to dissect that and see why.
Why did the First Lady have to go public with with what's going on in the White House?
Look, I look back.
Is the president not listening?
No, look, I look back to Nancy Reagan and her very famous fight with Don Regan. I look back at the way Hillary Clinton was very much involved in the day-to-day operations of the White House. This is not uncommon. The difference is Melania Trump is a private person, and when she sees something that she wants to weigh in on, she's done it. Now, look, she's done 2 separate interviews now where she said there are people in the White House that don't belong, and I think that's going to come to a change very soon.
All right. Corey Lewandowski, John Kelly going to be chief of staff by the end of the year?
I have no idea.
All right. We will leave it there. Up ahead, the Nancy Pelosi fight. Lots of Democrats claim they want her out and they want a new speaker. But who? As Ruth Marcus said earlier, you can't beat somebody with nobody. Stay with us. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.